Good morning and welcome to the live event, The Four Pillars of Self-Mastery. It may not be evident, but what I'm doing here is building a coaching model. So that's why I go into so much detail with this 7 performance series, the 7-step reset, the 7 phases or the 5 phases of the stimulus reaction cycle. So when we actually do the work, we're not thinking about it in terms of 7. We're just applying what we know. But this enables us to have a common language, number one. And number two, it gives us agency over that habit cycle, that stimulus response cycle that lasts less than a second, and where most people, at least the ones over 40 or 50 years old, have accepted the fact that, well, I just really can't change my personality. I can't change my identity. I can't change my habits. Some habits, the behavioral type habits, yeah, they can change those. They can stop eating chocolate. They can stop. They can stop parking close to where they're going and park far away. But when it comes to the reactive habits, where you see telling tension, or maybe when they react to somebody who's breaking a rule, those habits are harder to change. At least they perceive they are because they are constructs, they're summaries of many elements, and those elements have deep seated beliefs. So you have to change it at the element level. The same thing happens with identity type habits. Identity type habits are similar, but they're even more of a summary, more of a construct, and trying to change your personality or identity at the identity or personality level, you can see it doesn't work. So here's my view of the current world, the current situation, and this is why I'm doing this. Doing this to prepare coaches, consultants, leaders, business owners, anyone who has to get results through others. I'm doing this to give them a leg up. Now uh, two we're living through two forces of change that are compounding at the same time. First, the global environment is becoming less predictable. Power blocks are shifting. Trade relationships are being rewritten. Currency systems, supply chains, and political incentives are all moving. Whether you're a business owner, a leader, or a professional, you don't get to opt out. The world is more connected than ever, so volatility travels faster and hits deeper. Second, technology capability is accelerating, not in a steady line, but is compounding in waves. The results are simple. The cycle time of disruption keeps shrinking. Business models disappear, they appear, they dominate, and disappear faster than most people can update their thinking to recognize, oh, that model has changed, the landscape has changed. Even stable institutions, things that felt the same for decades, can suddenly become unstable when they collide with fast-moving forces. So here's the question that matters. What do you do when the outside world becomes less stable? My answer is you build agency and personal leadership that's aligned with that speed because you can't stop the 30,000 daily stimulus response cycles happening inside you, but you can get them working for you. This is why habit mastery and state mastery are important pillars of self mastery. And the real battle is not out there, it's inside that first second after a stimulus is received. In the first 0 to 500 milliseconds, your system runs a conditioned reaction based on past experiences and habit patterns. That was obviously good enough when institutions and business models change slowly. Not so much anymore. Agency is the ability to insert a pause, engage the conscious mind effectively, and choose the next response on purpose, all with the same kind of automaticity that has governed habit patterns for centuries. Consider 95% of what we do is by habit, and the external world is not only changing, but the rules for what is right and wrong or acceptable and unacceptable are changing, sometimes from week to week. That's what we're going to map today. That change, that rapid change that's happening, means that the 95% of our lives that are by habit, I hate to use this terminology, but that's what enables the matrix because everything is by habit. If we're asleep at the wheel and all these systems change and we're still reacting in very predictable ways because the powers that be, whether it's a marketer, an advertiser, an institution, they know from history what buttons to push to get the masses to react. If you've ever been in a seasonal business, even even if it's not seasonal, a retail business has a seasonal vibe because of the seasons. If you've been in that business for any length of time, I'm talking 3 or 4 years is all it takes. The repetition is uncanny. How every season, every year, in the first quarter, things seem to happen the same, even when it's different. And I was actually had a motorcycle business that was seasonal. So and you know, in motorcycles, there's your age range. If you did a bubble, you would say somewhere, okay, between 17 and maybe 27, 30 years old would be that higher peak of motorcycle buyers and riders. Even with that changing, right? There's always new 18-year-olds coming, and this was a global business. The fact that every year, like clockwork, things would happen the same way, different faces, but the same behaviors. So that's why I'm looking at this as a potential crisis. If we keep operating the same way we've always done, any bad actors know exactly what to do to get you to behave the way that serves them. And that's the backdrop of why I go so deep on this and why I'm doing daily events, because I don't hear this anywhere. No one's talking about this, and it's not something that's intuitive. But once you understand it, once you see it, it's very difficult to unsee. So let's take a look. I'm going to just kind of lay out some things. And this is my model of the world, my view. So yeah, I'd love to hear your comments, but I'm not suggesting that you adopt this view. We all have different views. For years, I used the demographic shifts. So if you think about demographics, there are baby boomers from 19 about 44 to say 1964. We had this huge spike or peak, but it peaked in 64. It didn't peak earlier. It peaked in 64 and then it went down. And then you had the Gen X's were born, and that group started, it was smaller, and that group, so I guess, yeah, you would say that the baby boom continued on. But yeah, so from 64 to, I think I want to say 72, you had the Gen X, but it was much smaller. And then from about 72 to 80, no, you know what it is? Yeah, 72. You know what? My numbers are blending here. So if the millennials, let's do it this way, millennials are 1980, right, to about 1996. There you go. And you had your baby boom generation. And so that would put the Gen Xers from 64 to 1980. All right, so let's do this again. Clean it up a little bit. So I want to make a point here that I use the demographics as a way to predict, or at least have a lens of what was likely to come. So if you have the baby boomers from 1944, it peaked in 1964, but it continued on. So let's say from from that peak, you then had the Gen X, and that went from the 1964 to 1980, and then you had the millennials. So this was somewhere between the size of the Gen X and the baby boomers, and that went to about 1996, and then you had Gen Z after that. So this would be boomers, this would be Xers, and this would be millennials. And the point in doing this, when you take this peak, 1960 at 1964, and you slip it 47 years, what you get is at 47, that's when people are spending the most amount of money in general. And if you think about your own life, if you're over 50 years old, you know that at 47, you probably had the most amount of cars in your life. You probably had the biggest house in your life. You probably had the most amount of relatives going to school or who needed your help and support at that time. So now at 47, we're spending the most amount of money. This was driving the economy, driving the stock market. And if you take this and slide it that 47 years, you get this thing that looks like this. That's 47. That's 1964 plus 47. And what's interesting is the U.S. stock market. It kind of mirrored it, and it makes sense because we're spending the most money, not amount of money. Now things change. The 2008 financial crisis was actually predicted to be more like 2010. It happened early. I feel like there was kind of a race to kind of do a money grab, and that moved that forward. This is the because the mortgage, what was going on with the mortgages was very different than what had happened before, and it literally put pressure on it and moved it forward. Then the liquidity crisis happened, and that's why you had the 2008 financial crisis, but it was only 2 years off. So in other words, the spend, the group, the biggest group spending the most amount of money in their lifetime, 47, that coincided with 2010 for this S&P 500. The financial crisis happened in 2008. So you can see why demographics still work, because I was just driving down the road the other day and I saw a vehicle that on the side of it, it was chair lifts or stair lifts. It was they installed stair lifts, and they were going out in we were in rural areas, and they were going to install, I guess, or coming from installing these stair lifts where you sit in the chair and it takes you up the stairs. That's clearly an older person thing in general, right? So you can see how businesses kept changing to match that. So you can get an idea of what's coming, which is why I have a transformation after 50, because for those people, that's my podcast, for those people who want to have a phase two after their main career. Transformation after 50 gives them the tools that they need to reset. That's why I call it a 7-step reset, to reset their identity, to reset their habit patterns so that they can thrive from 50 to 100. There's a lot of life left after 50. I was the other day skiing a guy 78 years old. Yesterday, a guy on the chairlift, 81 years old. And you know what the biggest problems are for these guys who are skiing at 75 and 80 years old? They're not complaining about inflammation, because that activity is actually anti-inflammatory. Any activity is anti-inflammatory because you're putting a demand on yourself. The biggest challenges are they're running out of people to ski with who are their age. And one guy, the 81-year-old guy, was talking about cataracts, how he had his cataracts removed, and he was in the small percentage of people who, after the cataracts removed, yes, he could see better, but he was much more sensitive to light. And the conversation is about what kind of lenses could he put in, et cetera. So my point is, it's not going to be long before I'm seeing people 90 plus out on the slopes because the baby boomers are getting older. So these are trends that you can pay attention to. Uh, Track days, you go to a track day, you'll inevitably see somebody in their 70s. And these are motorcycle track days. Clearly, in cars, people, even late 70s, are still driving on the track in cars. But motorcycle track days in their 70s, that's much more physically demanding than in the car. They're both mentally demanding, and they're both physically demanding to a degree because your heart rate does spike. Race car drivers, their heart rate will get up to over 200 beats per minute just from racing. There's just because of the adrenaline and all. The point being, you can see this shift happening if you pay attention to it and understand that the largest peak of births was in 1964. Now, that aside, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it, which I've used more recently, is the changing world order. And you can find videos on this. Ray Dalio, Changing World Order. He has two videos. One is 4 minutes and change, and the other one is 45 minutes and change. They say essentially the same thing. One's a summary view, and one goes into more detail with specifics. I like the one that goes into detail, but if you just want to know if you want to even spend time on this, I would say that look at the 4 minute one, because it does share some important things. Now, in the Changing World Order, what you had was This is the U.S., currently this world superpower, United States, and we're probably in stage 5 of 6, which is clearly on the decline side. So it rises, and then we peak, and then it declines. And you can watch the video to see what usually happens in this time frame. We replaced around 1944, and these are 80-year cycles roughly. Roughly, you had Great Britain, and the pound sterling was the reserve currency. So, right, you have the US now, and the USD is the world currency. When Great Britain was the superpower, you had the pound sterling as the currency. Before that, it was the Dutch, and you had the guilder as the world currency. And forgot who's before that one. But this is, if these are 80-year cycles, you can see this is sort of out of scope. Now, here's what's important. When you look at what's going on with the world power, and you can see why the world superpower also equals, quote unquote, the currency. So when the Dutch was the superpower, they were colonizing all over the world, and so naturally there would be all over the world is using that currency. Same thing happened to Great Britain. Great Britain was in so many different countries, and it made sense. After World War II, they were in debt. Great Britain was in debt and rebuilding from the war, and the U.S. rose as the world superpower. This is, we were manufacturing. We were a powerhouse. We were a powerhouse in so many different areas, and we chose to spend a lot of money on military. And the U.S. has used that military to keep reinforcing the U.S. dollar against competitors. Zooming out, you have this. You have the U.S. and again we're in that stage 5 decline, which is not fun because over here, all you had to do was show up. You show up, you get promoted. If you show up and do what you're supposed to do, you're going to get promoted because everything was growing. You start a business, the population growth took care of you because everything was rising. So even if you did it wrong, you still benefited because the population was growing, and the you had more buyers because the world, they were buying from us. We were exporters, so the world was buying for us. You started buying from us. You start a business, you're going to do well. Then up here, it got a little bit tougher, and this is in that 2000 stage. Is the 2008 financial crisis. So you had this coinciding along with that age 47, and now we're clearly in decline. And my view is this is why you're seeing a lot of crazy things going on, whether it's the shift towards oligarchs or the seeming what looks like power grabs. I'm watching videos selling things that were being sold in the early 2000s that have since become useless because of technology. For example, in trading, financial trading, once the the financial powerhouses started hiring first mathematicians and then technologists, it it put the individual trader out of business basically, because you can't keep up with those machines. They can do trades in milliseconds, so it's like you can't keep up. And I'm seeing courses now almost identical, almost the same ads that were being used in the early 2000s. There are people out there, obviously, if they're spending money on advertising, somebody's buying the stuff. There are people buying courses planning to be financial traders. And I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's one of those things. It's like, if you're a high school student, you plan to be an NBA player, your percentages, the deck is stacked against you. Now, that's just my opinion. You don't have to buy that, but I I started trading before online and was trading during the online shift, E Trade, and although I didn't use E Trade, I used uh, Charles Schwab because anyway, the way the platform was. Um, and then you went through into the early 2000s, and after the Nasdaq financial bubble, once that broke, then the although that financial, what who could pay for the technology financial I'm sorry, the technology capability, were the money houses. And so you saw a rise in the amount of technology in trading. And so if you're an individual trader and you're going against these big houses who are doing things on purpose, then this is why you can hear interest rates went up. That's why the market went down. Somebody else is saying, "Oh yeah, the market went up because interest rates went." I'm sorry, when the market goes up, yeah, interest rates. Some say down, some say up. Market goes down, some say down, some say up. And the way I look at it is you have people who are trying to move the market a little bit, influence the market so they could unwind positions. Because when you've got $1 billion in a position, you can't just unwind it. You're going to have some problems if you do. All that to say, there was money being made in here, and I'm seeing people selling those same models and pitching those same models when we're in a decline. It's not going to work. Again, this is why we need the agency and personal leadership, so you can have the critical thinking and the awareness to make some good decisions. Now, what's going on is we have China emerging. And I should have drawn this as a dotted line. So let's do that now. Let's draw this as a dotted line because we don't really know what's going to happen. And then we don't know what's going to happen here, right? The assumption, and if you look, when you look at Ray Dalio's Changing World Order, the assumption is that you have the US and you have China, and that China is replacing the US as the world superpower. You already see that we're splitting between, we've got the USD clearly was here. And as we move in this direction, you're getting USD and a little bit of BRICS. I think at a minimum, regardless of what happens, you're going to see BRICS get larger and larger relative to the US dollar. And what do I think is going to happen? I think we're going to have a multipolar kind of superpower construct that we've never had before. And if you look at what happened in China, which is where Ray Dalio did a lot of his study, they had all those empires going through this same kind of a cycle, and he used that to make some of his predictions or to inform his point of view around what's going to happen here. So whether you buy into this or not, and the reason why I separate it out and say, you know what, it doesn't matter what's happening with China, because a lot of people get into this fanboy mode and start downplaying what China's doing. And yes, the US is the US, the same way a fan would, hype what their team is doing, even though they've got a losing record. And so I don't want to get into a conversation about whether or not China is going to replace the US as the world superpower. I want to focus on what does the US do as it declines, because as we go through this decline, we're going to have some issues with uh, the trade. We're going to have issues with capital, right? So all of these come into play as this declines. And then when the dollars change and you start right now, people want dollars. They need dollars because you buy oil in dollars. The petro, you may have heard the term petrodollar. That's going to change here as we move in this direction to something else. I'm saying possibly multipolar, but regardless of what happens, we know that the US is on a decline and China's on a rise. Now, what could happen? The reason I did this as a dotted line, and here's what I would hope happens, is that the US gets to turn this around and does something else. And I think that's what the people on the bullish side are hoping happens, and maybe cryptocurrency becomes a solution, and and maybe this even is equal to that, or maybe it's above China. Who knows what's going to happen? But I do think there's some kind of a multipolar, because the alternative is not good. The alternative is how these end is usually something more drastic. So this is one lens to use, and that's the shift to the world superpowers. a little issue here. Hold on. The other way to look at this is to say, the other way to look at this is to take what's been going on with technology. So if you look at a curve, uh, if you take a penny and double it every day for 20 days, it's or for 30 days, it's something like $1 million. And the end of the curve, those last few years, it's almost vertical, and it makes sense because if you're doubling it, the last 3 or 4 years is major doubling. If you take $1,000 and double it 10 years, halfway you're at 32,000. So 5 years in, you're at $32,000. But then by 10 years, you're at 1 million. And in the last couple of years, so you've doubled from a 500,000 to 1 million, and before that from a 250,000 to a 500,000. That's why the exit of it gets steep. Now, this is just a 10-year curve. We've had technology doubling every 18 to 24 months since 1970. So that you talk about a steep curve on technology capacity. Before it was chips, now it's application and how it's used. But if you think about it like that, we've been vertical for a while, and this is why you can look at this is why you can look at things like AI replacing or coming online. So the current AI systems that are being built are a fraction. I'm talking single digit percentage fraction of the cost of what the initial AI models were. And you've seen this with technology all along. The first few apps, very expensive, then the ones that replace them, very cheap. So this is happening at the same time. And in Ray Dalio's work, he talks about there being five wars: technology war, capital war, trade war, geopolitical war, and military war. And that technology war, we see that happening between US and China. So this is playing out. You see the trade war between US and China, the capital war between US and China, between USD and BRICS. So those are three out of the five. I'm not suggesting there's a war. My point is that we need a different way of interacting with the world because it is changing. I was in preparing for this, I thought about something kind of interesting. So in the 60s, I remember as a kid, we when we would hear the fire engines, we would run to where they were and watch them put out the fire. And sometimes there were false alarms. And we get so angry when there was a false alarm. But we would watch them put out the fire. And what's interesting is fire hydrants today look and are designed, apparently, maybe there's some small changes inside, the same as the fire hydrants 60 and 70 years ago. The firehouse, the same. They look the same. Obviously upgraded some, but the structure's the same. You have a hose truck, you have a ladder truck, and you have a chief car. The big difference is the chief car went from a car to an SUV. But when you think about that and how we interact with the physical world, that it hasn't changed, and you can look at business models the same way, they've been very steady like that. They change, slow to change. So you can build a business model. I remember when I set up my motorcycle business, I remember how many people would tell me, "Oh yeah, the thing to do." And these were business people. They said the thing to do is you have to copy what somebody else is doing and charge a lower price. That was the mantra. You copy what someone else is doing, charge a lower price. That doesn't work anymore, obviously. And then you have the from the mid 2000s or right after the crisis to about I would say up to near 2020 when disruption was the thing. It's like every technology company out there was looking to disrupt something, and as that in that disruption, they would take out the profit. And if I was doing Uber back then because I had to transport motorcycles and go back and get them and whatever. And so I remember because I started taking taxis. This was early 2014. I was taking taxis, and then I switched to Uber. Uber was a quarter of the price of the taxi, so it made sense to start using Uber over the years, because I kept using it over the years, I would see the Uber taxis would go away, the Uber price came up, and within I would say 2 or 3 years, the Uber price was as high as the taxi price was before that. And we see this with other disruptive technologies. You look at Amazon, same thing. Amazon was super cheap in some areas, and some products, and now you look at them and you got to be careful because you may be paying more just because you're on Amazon thinking it's going to be cheaper. So you have to pay attention to that. But the re- the reason is that I bring that up is that things are changing so fast and those old business models don't work. And whether you're a business leader or uh, an owner or in government, whatever it is, you can't be asleep at the wheel. This whole 95% of everything we do is by habit. So when I go out skiing and I'm on the gondola and the chairlift, politics never comes up. If I go on social media, certain areas on social media, everybody's talking about breaking news and this happened and that happened and the flooding the zone. And there are people who appear to be completely oblivious to this. It's not just skiing, hiking. It's you go into the car enthusiasts. These people aren't thinking about that stuff, and it's going to affect them. That's why I'm working on this one step at a time. So we got the global order shift I covered, the technology acceleration, the 95% by habit, and the rules changing sometimes weekly, if not sooner. The goalpost change, and that's one of the ones that are most disturbing for me, is how decades ago companies would not lie to the company. They would get up to the line, but they wouldn't cross it. Politicians would not lie. They would spin it, but they wouldn't lie. Today, we see advertising that's literally blasting another company. I remember, I can't prove it, but I remember somebody because I was using search. I was had a global business, so I did a lot through search. I remember it appears that somebody must have been clicking my ads to use up my dollars, to use up my daily ad spend. Another time, I saw thousands of dollars evaporate in my ads and no results. And I went down in the digging the hole. I won't say the country it was from because it can happen anywhere. It wasn't the U.S. But what I found was there was a pornographic site with a lot of thumbnails, and people could click on those thumbnails. And when they clicked on those thumbnails, it was the link to my ads. And so obviously these people weren't thinking about motorcycles. And so these clicks just kept hitting. And I guess they were then promoting that page out. And people would click this and it just used up all this money. And it's like, what's going on? So it wasted money. So it made me a little bit, you know, I get a little bit more analytical when it comes to spending advertising. And along those lines, I also watched how the once we got into using social media to push political narratives and to spend money, I watched the volatility of ad spend just go wild when you look at the spend versus results. So there are a lot of people who don't realize that, and they're chasing ad strategies. And especially in a U.S. election year, if you're advertising in the U.S. and it's a presidential election year, or even a mid-cycle election year, as you near that November timeframe, the numbers go crazy because politicians don't have to meet an ROI. They just have to get the word out. They just want to push the word out. And they have millions of dollars to work with, and they plow this millions of dollars into social media ads, and it's going to increase the cost of all the ads. So that's just the reality of what's going on, and you need multiple ways of thinking about this thing. Now that's where the habit mastery and state mastery come into play. So what we have here, this started as for me, it started It started not here, but here. I wanted to have 7 performance areas, and I have been involved in six areas of life, 12 areas of life, and all. And I knew that each one was missing something. I landed on 7: mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional. This is the left side. It's what we control. Emotional is the gateway to the right side. You've probably seen this before. And then we have relationship, professional, financial. And the point is get these in order first, and then you can pursue this. So if you start here with your quest, you're going to have breakdowns over here. And the faster the pace of change, the more likely you're going to have breakdown because you have identity issues, you have limiting belief issues, and you notice have it faintly be, do, have. This also aligns with setting the identity before going after your quest. Turns out it also aligns with emotional intelligence, self awareness, and self management. This came about when I was connecting it with dynamic leadership. And self awareness, self management, self mastery is foundational for dynamic leadership and aligns with emotional intelligence. Not to take anything at all away from emotional intelligence is very powerful. What's different between what I'm teaching and emotional intelligence is when emotional intelligence was created in around the mid 90s, neuroscience wasn't far enough along to understand that it's not a subconscious mind. It's actually a network of neurons, and the network of neurons is completely separate from the conscious mind. They have very different functions. One is energy going through neural pathways. The other one is actually thinking. And so the mind is not the brain at work. The brain at work is what we used to call the subconscious, and the mind is something else. The mind can relate the unrelated. The mind can design in the field of infinite possibilities. The subconscious can't really do that. I call it a network of neurons, but I will not call it the mind. And then you have social awareness and relationship management. And this is like the right side. This is the relationships, professional and financial. So you need both sets. So my self mastery is here, and then over here we have leadership, and at the one-to-one level, which is where your frontline leaders live. Even though they may have a team of 12 people, it's still leading one-to-one, and then you lead as a group. And then executive leadership, it's setting the climate, one to many. And that's why I created the 7 step reset, because what was happening is as people get through and you get the identity shift, and then you do the relationship, professional and financial, and the stakes on the quest go up. As that happened, people would end up getting falling back into getting triggered or some other kind of reaction that they didn't want, and they would lose time. So what I did was catalog how I work with them. This is what I would do. I go back through this 7 steps, and we just redo the habit. And once you get the common language, it's easy. It's just a matter of mentioning a word, and the common language kicks in and helps them. So here's the thing. Now, this is the subconscious side, and I'm going to show you the conscious side. So this is the subconscious side of a stimulus reaction. This is just the 5 phases of stimulus, and it's actually stimulus reaction because the response comes later. So you have pre-listening. So the subconscious conscious or network of neurons is always pre-listening. It's predicting what's going to happen. You walk into a specific situation, and you feel some kind of emotion, some kind of a sense, because your central nervous system and brain thinks this is going to be good, or it's going to be bad, it's going to be neutral, whatever it is. You're already primed for that. And then you have initial detection. So this is all these two are inside the quarter of a second reaction time. So if you look up what's the reaction time of the subconscious, you're going to find a quarter of a second. But it's not doing nothing. It's actually doing the initial detection and the rapid appraisal. This is where your cognitive biases come into play. This is where your meta programs come into play. This is where the path of least resistance, which is what a habit is. A habit is it follows the neural pathway. That's the path of least resistance, and that has to do with myelin and synapses. So during this quarter of a second, before the subconscious has a chance to even know it's this is happening. So by the time the reaction formation happens, it's already biased. This is why we do the positivity exercise. A couple of days ago, I did that. This is why we have emotional modulation. This is why we have swish pattern. This is why we have attentional priming. All those things we can impact this. This is when I talk about we're going to install this at the subconscious level, we're going to install it at the habit level. That's what I'm talking about. We do things at the habit level. So when the reaction formation is being done, the negative effects of cognitive bias, some of the limiting beliefs, those are already neutralized by the time we get here. This is why you have fewer stimulus response cycles a day. This is why you have fewer stress kind of episodes. Then this starts the handoff process. There's a pre-conscious surfacing. What's happening between here and here? The reaction is energy going through neural pathways and its associations, and it's 100 billion neurons, each connected to 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons, meaning there's trillions and trillions of connections. That energy going through the neural pathways is a signal. That signal has to be converted into something that a construct that can be perceived by the conscious mind. Now, I call it a construct. It could be a thought. We're going to call it a thought, but it could also be an internal sensation. It could be a body sensation. It could be a feeling. It could be an emotion. Something comes up that, but it has to be packaged in a way that can be perceived by the conscious mind. So the autopilot handoff to conscious mind, and I call it construct, aka thought, because it could be other things besides quote unquote thought. And then we get to the conscious mind. The conscious mind construct, here's the phases there. You have conscious engagement. So this is that pre-surfacing hands off here. The conscious mind comes online. And the reason I have a different color here is because we don't want our response to equal our reaction. This is what the the bad actors count on. This is what con men, before technology, con men were doing it face to face. And what they would count on is that the person, if they pushed certain buttons, the person would do a certain thing. Same thing with all the carnival barkers, all that stuff. They know that there's a pattern that people follow, and it's very, very predictable. And this is why it's essential to understand that these are two parts, and to build in your pause in between the two and engage your conscious mind thinking before you just act. Then there's a pause and an interrupt. And this here, I have this down here as like, this is a half a second. So this is a half second total because you have a quarter of a second reaction time and then a quarter of a second to form it while waiting for the conscious mind to come online. The conscious mind comes online. So that's 500 to 1,000 milliseconds. But this pause interrupt could be as long as you need it to be. This thing could be a minute. It could be 2 seconds. It's whatever you want. After that pause interrupt, then you have the prioritization of it. Where does this fit? And this is where you want to make a distinction between important versus urgent. This is where I start talking about using the two-axis matrices. Are we talking about the what, or are we talking about the how? This is where you can make that distinction: effectiveness versus efficiency. That comes in here. And then yesterday I talked about using attentional priming and rapid optioning, so that when we're in this phase over here, which is where you can program it in, you can literally program in attentional priming and uh, rapid optioning, so that when it hands off to the conscious mind, it's not just handing off some reaction, look out, there's a tiger coming. It's handing off a clearly defined, for example, a clearly defined problem statement, or maybe it's providing a suggested response. It's doing some kind of analysis so that you get a better recommendation here, and that's going to feed this. But anyway, back to the point. So this is could be effectiveness, efficiency. It could be fast versus accuracy. Whatever it is, the two-axis matrix is a good way to split this up. And then we have the next step, the next best step, and that's the handoff to the action. So there's another action step, and that would be steps 5 and 6. 5 is optional. If you need emotional modulation, we do the emotional modulation. You don't want to be triggered in doing action. That's a step that takes anywhere from a second to 90 seconds if you need it, but you don't always need it. So that is why I am breaking it down, because now I can apply levers and drivers to these different phases. There's things we can do here. 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 And over time, I will tell you, I can, in working with a client, I can tell, not scientifically accurate, not scientific accurately, but I can tell what's going on over here. I can certainly tell if the issue is on the network of neurons side, or if it's on the conscious mind side. And sometimes you can tell just by speed. If it's a fast reaction, it comes up right away. You've seen people get telling tension. You mention a word, and you see them, they got to talk, right? Because of the, couldn't see my facial expressions. No, what I was saying is that you see that telling tension where you're talking, you mention a word, and people are like, what? I gotta say this, okay, yeah. And you can see their mouth moving, they want to say something. That's happened so fast. That's a reaction. That's on the network of neurons side. And you want to be aware of that. I mentioned the other day, because I was my role was building high performing teams to do big initiatives. So I was always in change. I was all For 15 years of my career, it was always new things. And even before that, I would say 20 years, 20 slightly over 20 years of my career was always introducing new things, whether it was quality or better prospecting or consulting or a consulting model or in technology, and then adding portals, and then CRM. There's always something new that was coming. I remember doing compliance stuff. And because it was new, I got in the habit of providing context so people wouldn't think it's, oh, that's just like this. Oh, it's just like that. But what happened over time is I kind of edged toward giving more context. Now, looking back, I realize what could happen when you give too much context or the wrong kind of context. You can still trigger things. I may be giving context to have one thing happen, but because I use words and words are associated with feelings and emotions and beliefs, things would get triggered, and I'd have people like come out of the blue like getting annoyed, and they'd be like freaking out, and it's like we're not even talking about that, but something got associated inside of them. So you have to be careful. Now I give shorter context, and I talk about it's not that, it's not this, what we're going to be saying is here. And then I also will often say we're going to leave questions, I'll address those things later. I just have to get the people off of that telling tension mode. So that next time I will get into an important topic of mental rehearsal, because mental rehearsal is a powerful tool. Then there's different kinds of mental rehearsal. There's visualization, there's different kinds of visualization. There's implementation intentions, there's deep practice, there's and when I look at a visualization, there's at least four of them, if not five. There's the outcome visualization, the process visualization, there's obstacle visualization, identity visualization, deep practice visualization, and all those are important. And as a leader or business owner, consultant, coach, you want to know what those are. And then there are other forms of mental rehearsal that are not visualization. I'll give you an example. I already talked about how the fire trucks and fire hydrants basically are the same as they were 60 or 70 years ago. But when we're deciding what's going to be there 10 years from now or 5 years from now, we don't have any hooks to hang that stuff on. We have no guarantee that government structures are going to be what they are today. There are people who believe that AI can run everything, that we don't need these positions anymore because AI is going to do it. There's already talk about how business owners are going to have to decide between using robot trucks versus real trucks. And, obviously there's big changes that come with that. Whatever you're thinking is going to be happening in the next 5 or 10 years, you can't really make a picture of it because you have no hooks to hang it on. Buildings will probably be the same if you're doing buildings, but how we use the buildings will probably be different, especially if you have like maybe more like 10, 15 years. If there's a lot of robots moving around, those buildings will shift and how they're designed. But the point is you can't visualize something that you have no frameworks for, no mental constructs for, and that becomes sensing. You become sensing a state. You're mentally rehearsing a state that you want to be in, and then you could visualize the next step. But it's like having an arm ramp. So I do a lot of on ramp work. I do, we talk about what's the on ramp, because on ramps you can get our head wrapped around, but I can't get my head wrapped around something that we're designing in from within the field of infinite possibility. And that's essentially what we're doing now. If you're a business owner or a business leader and you're projecting what you're going to do 10 or 15 years from now, that's infinite possibilities. We're not going to be able to use traditional visualization. It still has a place, but you're also going to have to use this mental rehearsal where you're using a state. So I'll talk about that on Monday. Tomorrow I'll do a recap of what we covered this week, and then next week I'll start talking about visualization and mental rehearsal. All right, that's it. We'll see you tomorrow.